The silence in the great hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy sat in their seats, waiting. Some had scales that shimmered under the bright lights. Others had fur that moved like waves in an ocean. A few had skin that looked like living metal. But they all had one thing in common. They were all staring at the tall, crystal-like creature that stood in the center of the room. Zekthara moved slowly toward the speaking platform. Her body was made of what looked like clear glass, but it was alive and breathing. 4 arms hung at her sides, and deep scars ran across her surface, like cracks in a broken window. The burns from plasma weapons had left dark marks that would never heal. Her legs shook with each step, and she had to grip the rail to keep from falling. The Galactic Council's War Crimes Tribunal was meeting for the first time in over 200 years. The last time had been when the Krex Empire had used poison gas on civilian populations. Before that, it was the Stellar Federation's use of planet-killing weapons. But this time was different. This time, the accused were humans. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the defendant's box, his hands folded on the table in front of him. His face was weathered from years of space travel, and his gray hair was cut short in military style. He wore the dark blue uniform of the Human Defense Force, with ribbons and medals covering his left chest. His eyes were steady as he watched the alien approach the microphone. Next to him sat his lawyer, Lisa Harper. She was younger than Morrison, maybe 40 years old, with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her fingers moved quickly over her tablet, pulling up files and documents. She had been one of Earth's best criminal defense attorneys before the war started. Now she was defending her entire species. The judges sat at a long table that curved around the room like a crescent moon. 12 different species were represented, each one chosen for their neutrality in the human-alien conflicts. The chief judge was a being called Mordak, whose purple skin seemed to glow in the artificial light. His 6 eyes moved independently as he looked around the room. The tribunal recognizes Ambassador Zekthara of the Vorthan Empire, Mordak said. His voice came through the translation devices as a deep rumble. You may begin your testimony. Zekthara's voice was like music when she spoke. Even through the translators, it had a singing quality that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. But the words she spoke were not beautiful at all. Honored judges, she began, I stand before you today not as a warrior, but as a survivor. I am perhaps the only high-ranking Vorthan military officer who lived through direct combat with human forces. What I will tell you today may be hard to believe. It was hard for me to believe, even as I lived through it. She paused and looked around the room. Her crystal-like eyes reflected the lights like prisms, sending small rainbows across the walls. My name is Zekthara, and I was a fleet commander in the Vorthan 4th Battle Group. 3 years ago, my superiors gave me what they called a simple mission. We were to occupy the human mining colonies in the Outer Rim territories. It was supposed to be easy work. Captain Morrison's face did not change, but Lisa Harper made a note on her tablet. The humans were a young species, Zekthara continued. They had only been in space for a few hundred years. Their technology was primitive compared to ours. Their ships were slow, and their weapons were weak. The war planners told us it would take maybe a few weeks to complete the conquest. We would demand their surrender, they would give up, and we would add their worlds to our empire. That was how warfare worked in civilized space. She turned to look directly at Captain Morrison. I had fought in 12 different campaigns before this one. Against the Stellar Coalition, the Free Traders Alliance, the hegemony of worlds. In every case, when one side clearly had the advantage, the weaker side would surrender. Civilians would be relocated, military prisoners would be exchanged, and life would go on. That was the civilized way. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more frightening. The humans changed everything. The room was completely silent now. Even the air recycling systems seemed to have stopped making noise. Everyone was waiting to hear what came next. Our first contact with human forces happened near a mining world called New Dakota. My fleet consisted of 47 ships, including 3 heavy cruisers and a battle carrier. We had over 10,000 soldiers ready for ground assault. The humans had maybe 15 ships, all of them smaller than our destroyers. Zekthara moved closer to the microphone, her crystal form catching the light. I sent the standard surrender demand. In galactic law, when forces are outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, the weaker side is expected to yield. It prevents unnecessary death and destruction. Every civilized species knows this. She paused again, and for a moment, her confident tone wavered. The human response came from Captain Morrison's ship, the HFY. It was a single word, transmitted on all frequencies so that both fleets could hear it clearly. The alien looked around the room one more time before continuing. The word was no. Even the judges seemed surprised by this. Wars in civilized space were fought with rules and protocols. Surrendering when outnumbered was not cowardice. It was common sense. I thought there had been a translation error, Zekthara said. So, I sent the surrender demand again, this time with detailed scans showing our superior numbers and firepower. Surely they would see reason. She turned to face Captain Morrison directly. The second response was longer. Captain Morrison said, and I quote from the recording, "Come and take it." The crystalline being's voice began to shake. That was when I realized that everything we knew about warfare, everything we understood about civilization and common sense, meant nothing to the humans. They were not going to surrender. They were going to fight, even though they had no chance of winning. Her forearms gestured helplessly. I had no choice but to attack. In my culture, in every culture I knew, such a battle would last maybe an hour. The humans would realize their mistake, surrender, and we would accept their yield with honor. But that is not what happened. Zekthara's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but in the silent room, everyone could hear her clearly. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about war, about death, and about what it means to be human. The alien survivor looked around the room one final time before continuing. The humans did not just fight us. They fought like nothing I had ever seen before. They fought like demons from the old stories. They fought like they wanted to die. She stepped back from the microphone, her crystal body trembling. And that was only the beginning. Zekthara's crystal form seemed to dim as she continued her testimony. The lights in the great hall reflected off her scarred surface, creating patterns that danced across the walls like broken glass. She gripped the speaking platform with 2 of her 4 hands, her body shaking with memories she clearly did not want to relive. The battle began at exactly 1400 hours. Station time, she said, her musical voice now carrying a note of dread. I gave the order to advance in standard formation. 3 heavy cruisers in the center, destroyers on the flanks, fighters providing cover. It was textbook military doctrine, the same formation that had won us victories across the galaxy. Captain. Morrison sat perfectly still in his chair, his weathered face showing no emotion. His lawyer, Lisa Harper, continued taking notes on her tablet, but her eyes never left the alien witness. The human ships were arranged in what looked like a defensive formation around New Dakota, Zekthara continued. Captain Morrison's vessel, the U.S. Defiant, was at the center. It was barely half the size of our smallest cruiser. Our weapon systems showed that their armor was thin, their shields were weak. My tactical officer estimated we could destroy their entire fleet in less than 30 minutes. She paused, her crystal eyes reflecting the light like prisms. What happened next defied every rule of space combat I had ever learned. The alien survivor moved closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Instead of maintaining their defensive positions, the human ships did something impossible. They charged straight at us. A murmur ran through the assembled representatives. Even species that had never fought in space wars knew that smaller, weaker ships did not charge larger, stronger ones. It was military suicide. I thought it was a mistake, Zekthara said. Perhaps their formation had broken down, or their communications were damaged. But then I heard the transmission from the UE Sisyphiant. Captain Morrison was speaking to his entire fleet, and our interceptors picked up every word. She turned to look directly at Morrison. He said, "All ships, this is Morrison. Today we show these invaders what humans are made of. We don't retreat. We don't surrender. We make them pay for every inch of space. For Earth. For humanity. Attack." The crystal being's voice began to shake again. The human ships accelerated to full speed, directly toward our battle line. Their fighters launched from the carriers, not in careful formations, but in a wild swarm. They came at us like a wave of metal and fire. Zekthara moved away from the microphone, her forearms gesturing as if she were still trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. Our heavy guns opened fire. We hit the human ships again and again. I watched 3 of their destroyers explode in the first minute of combat, but the rest kept coming. She stopped and looked around the room, her crystal eyes seeming to search for understanding among the alien faces. That was when I saw something that still haunts my dreams. One of the human fighters, a small craft no bigger than a shuttle, was struck by our plasma cannons. Its hull was torn open, atmosphere was venting into space, and half its wing was gone. The alien's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Any sane pilot would have ejected or tried to limp back to safety. But this human pilot, Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez, according to our intercepts, did neither. He aimed his dying ship directly at one of our cruisers and accelerated. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. A fighter crashed into our cruiser's reactor section, Zekthara continued. Both ships were destroyed in the explosion. 1,500 Vorthan crew members died instantly. But what terrified me was not the death. It was the transmission we intercepted from Rodriguez just before impact. He was laughing. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the judges seemed stunned by this revelation. But the space battle was only the beginning, the alien survivor said. When it became clear that we could not easily destroy the human fleet, I ordered a ground assault on New Dakota. We had taken several hundred human civilians prisoner during our initial occupation. According to all rules of civilized warfare, this should have ended the conflict immediately. She turned back to face the tribunal. I transmitted to Captain Morrison that we held his people hostage. I told him that if he did not surrender, we would execute them one by one. In every previous war, such a threat would bring immediate capitulation. No civilized species would sacrifice innocent lives for military objectives. Zekthara's crystal form seemed to crack slightly as she continued. Captain Morrison's response was not what I expected. He said, "Those people knew the risks when they chose to live on the frontier. Do what you want with them. We're coming for you anyway." The alien's voice broke completely now. 20 minutes later, human ground forces attacked our positions on New Dakota. They did not try to rescue their civilians. They did not attempt to negotiate. They simply attacked with everything they had. She moved closer to the judge's table, her scarred surface reflecting the lights like broken mirrors. The human soldiers were led by a woman named Staff Sergeant Amy Collins. She had been stationed on New Dakota before the war, so she knew the mining tunnels and industrial complexes better than we did. But knowing the territory was not what made her dangerous. Zekthara, 4 hands clenched into fists. What made her dangerous was that she was willing to destroy everything to deny it to us. She used explosives to collapse mine shafts, even though human civilians were still trapped inside. She flooded industrial areas with toxic chemicals, killing both our soldiers and her own people. She turned the entire colony into a weapon. The crystal being's voice grew stronger, but more frightened. I watched through our surveillance systems as Collins led her troops through the mining complex. When they found groups of human civilians held prisoner by our forces, they did not try to negotiate or trade for their release. They simply attacked, using grenades and automatic weapons in confined spaces where their own people could be killed. She paused, looking around the room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. One of our commanders, thinking he could reason with her, transmitted a message offering to release the civilians in exchange for safe passage off the planet. Collins transmitted back a single word, negative. The alien's voice dropped to a whisper again. She then proceeded to detonate explosives that brought down the entire mining complex. Over 300 human civilians died in the collapse, along with nearly 1,000 of our soldiers. But she did not stop there. Zekthara turned to face Captain Morrison one final time. When the dust settled, Collins and her surviving troops hunted down every remaining Borthan soldier on the planet. They showed no mercy to the wounded, no quarter to those who tried to surrender. They killed every one of my people they could find. The crystal being's form seemed to dim even further. And then, when the planet was secure, she transmitted a message to her fleet. She said, "New Dakota is ours. Send the next wave." The alien survivor stepped back from the microphone, her entire body trembling. That was when I realized that we were not fighting a war. We were fighting for survival against a species that had no limits, no mercy, and no fear of death. The humans had turned warfare itself into something unrecognizable. She looked around the room one last time before continuing. And that was still only the beginning of what they would do to us. The tribunal hall remained silent as Zekthara composed herself. Her crystal form had dimmed considerably, and the scars across her surface seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. She moved back to the microphone, her forearms trembling as she gripped the platform. After the disaster at New Dakota, our high command expected the humans to seek peace talks. She began, her musical voice now carrying a bitter edge. In every previous conflict, when both sides had suffered heavy losses, diplomats would step in to negotiate terms. That is how civilized beings conduct warfare. Captain Morrison's face remained expressionless, but Lisa Harper glanced at him with concern. The alien's testimony was painting a picture of human brutality that could have serious consequences for their entire species. But the humans did not seek peace, Zekthara continued. Instead, they did something that defied all military logic. They began hunting us. She paused, her crystal eyes reflecting the lights like broken glass. Within days of the New Dakota battle, human ships appeared throughout the sector. Not in formation, not following standard patrol routes, but moving, like predators stalking prey. They had studied the wreckage of our ships, analyzed our technology, and learned our weaknesses. The alien survivor moved closer to the judge's table. Captain Morrison's forces captured one of our supply convoys near the asteroid belt of Kepler 442. Instead of destroying the ships and taking prisoners, they did something we had never seen before. They kept the ships intact and used them as bait. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more terrifying. They sent false distress signals using our own communication codes. When our rescue ships arrived, they found what looked like a standard pirate attack, but when they moved in to help, human ships appeared from behind the asteroids. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. The human trap was perfect, Zekthara said. They had learned our rescue protocols, our formation tactics, even our communication patterns. But what shocked me most was how quickly they had adapted. It had been less than a week since New Dakota, and they were already using our own methods against us. She turned to face the tribunal directly, but that was nothing compared to what happened at the mining station. The alien's crystal form seemed to crack slightly as she continued. The Vorthen mining station at Kepler 442b was our main supply depot for the sector. It housed over 5,000 workers and had defenses that could hold off a major fleet. Our commanders thought it was safe from human attack. Zekthara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Commander Rick Patterson led the assault on the station. He had only 300 Marines, but they did not attack like any military force we had ever encountered. They used the station against itself. She paused, her four hands clenching into fists. Patterson's forces breached the station's life support systems. Instead of simply cutting off the air, they pumped toxic gases into specific sections. They used the artificial gravity generators to crush defenders in their own corridors. They turned the medical bay into a torture chamber. The assembled representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even species that had fought brutal wars had never heard of such tactics. The humans did not just want to capture the station, Zekthara continued. They wanted to break us psychologically. They used our own communication systems to broadcast the screams of dying Vorthen workers. Throughout the complex, they made us listen as our people begged for mercy that never came. Captain Morrison's hands remained folded on the table, but his knuckles had gone white. But the worst part was what they did to the prisoners, the alien said, her voice breaking. My friend, Sub-Commander Valtara, was captured during the assault. The humans kept her alive for interrogation, but they did not just ask questions. They studied her. Zekthara's crystal form began to shake violently. They brought in a human, scientist Dr. Helen Burke. She was not a soldier, but she was more terrifying than any warrior I had ever encountered. She studied Vorthen physiology, like we were laboratory specimens. The alien survivor turned to look directly at Captain Morrison. Dr. Burke discovered that our crystal-based biology could be slowly dissolved with common acids. She tested different concentrations, different application methods, different time intervals. She documented everything with scientific precision. Her voice became barely audible. Valtara was kept alive for 17 days. Every day, Dr. Burke would dissolve a small part of her body and record the results. She measured pain responses, healing rates, psychological reactions. She treated my friend like a test subject, not a living being. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the judges seemed horrified by this revelation. When Valtara finally died, Dr. Burke was disappointed, Zekthara said. Not because she had killed a prisoner, but because she had run out of test subjects. She requested more Vorthen captives for her experiments. The crystal being's voice grew stronger, but filled with rage. That was when I realized that the humans were not just brutal warriors. They were scientists of cruelty. They studied suffering the way other species studied physics or chemistry. They made torture into an art form. She moved back to the microphone, her scarred surface reflecting the lights like broken mirrors. But even that was not enough for them. When they learned that we had emotional bonds with our crew members, they used that against us too. They forced prisoners to watch their friends die slowly. They made us choose which of our comrades would be subjected to experiments. Zekthara's four arms spread wide in a gesture of helplessness. They discovered that we value honor above life itself, so they created situations where any choice we made would destroy our sense of dignity. They turned our own values into weapons against us. The alien's voice dropped to a whisper again. And the worst part was that their methods worked. Under the psychological pressure, some of us broke. We gave them information about our military, installations, our supply lines, are civilian populations. She looked around the room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. I was one of those who broke. Captain Morrison's face remained impassive, but Lisa Harper stopped taking notes and looked up at the alien witness with surprise. After 3 weeks of imprisonment aboard the human vessel UE as retribution, I could no longer resist, Zekthara said, her voice filled with shame. I told them everything. Fleet positions, defensive weaknesses, civilian evacuation routes. I betrayed my own species to make the psychological torture stop. The crystal being's form seemed to dim even further. The information I provided led to the destruction of 3 Vorthan colonies. Over 12 million of my people died because I could not withstand what the humans did to my mind. She turned to face Captain Morrison one final time. And when I finally gave them what they wanted, do you know what their response was? They thanked me politely and continued the experiments anyway. They had already learned everything they needed to know about breaking Vorthan psychology. The alien survivor stepped back from the microphone, her entire body trembling. The humans had not just defeated us militarily. They had studied us like insects, learned our weaknesses, and used them to destroy us from within. They had turned warfare into a science. She looked around the room at the assembled representatives, her crystal eyes reflecting their horrified faces. And that was still not the end of what they were capable of doing. The great hall of the tribunal seemed to grow colder as Zekthara continued her testimony. Her crystal form had lost most of its inner light, and the scars across her surface now looked like deep cracks in ancient ice. She moved slowly back to the microphone, her forearms shaking so badly that she could barely grip the platform. My imprisonment aboard the UE Retribution lasted for 4 months. She began, her musical voice now barely above a whisper. During that time, I learned something about humans that terrified me more than their weapons or their brutality. I learned how they think. Captain Morrison sat perfectly still, his weathered face showing no emotion. But Lisa Harper had stopped, taking notes entirely, and was staring at the alien witness with growing concern. The ship's commander was Captain Morrison himself, Zekthara said, turning to look directly at the human defendant. I expected him to be a monster, a savage creature, driven by bloodlust and hatred. Instead, I found something much worse. I found a man who was completely calm, completely rational, and completely without mercy. She paused, her crystal eyes reflecting the lights like broken prisms. Every day, Captain Morrison would visit my cell, not to interrogate me, not to torture me, but simply to talk. He would sit across from me and speak about human history, human culture, human philosophy. At first, I thought he was trying to break me psychologically. The alien's voice grew softer, but somehow more frightening. But as the weeks passed, I realized he was not trying to break me. He was trying to educate me. He wanted me to understand why the humans fought the way they did. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. He told me about human wars, Zekthara continued. Not their recent conflicts in space, but the wars they fought on their home planet for thousands of years. He spoke of battles where entire cities were destroyed, where civilians were killed by the millions, where soldiers fought until every last person was dead. She moved closer to the judge's table, her scarred surface reflecting their horrified faces. He told me about something called the Second World War, where humans killed over 50 million of their own species. He described weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. He spoke of camps where humans systematically murdered other humans by the millions. The assembled representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even species that had fought brutal wars had never heard of such systematic destruction. But what shocked me most was not the scale of the killing, Zekthara said. It was how calmly Captain Morrison described it. He spoke of these horrors as if they were natural events, like storms or earthquakes. He said that war was simply part of human nature. The alien survivor's voice began to break. He told me that humans had been fighting each other for so long, that they had perfected the art of total warfare. Every tactic we had witnessed, every brutal strategy, every psychological weapon they had used against us, they had first used against their own species. She turned to face the tribunal directly. Captain Morrison said that when humans encountered other species for the first time, they did not see potential friends or trading partners. They saw potential enemies, and they prepared for war accordingly. The crystal being's form seemed to crack even further as she continued. He showed me recordings of human military training. Children as young as 6 years old were taught to fight. They played games that simulated warfare. They learned to see violence as entertainment. Zekthara's 4 hands clenched into fists. He explained that humans had evolved as predators. Their ancestors had hunted other animals for survival. They had competed with other human groups for resources. They had developed brains that were designed for conflict. The alien's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Captain Morrison told me that peace was not natural for humans. It was something they had to work at, something they had to force themselves to maintain. But war, he said, war was as natural to humans as breathing. She paused, looking around the room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. He said that when the Vorthan Empire attacked human colonies, we had made a fundamental mistake. We had awakened something that humans had spent centuries trying to control. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the judges seemed stunned by this revelation. Captain Morrison explained that humans had rules for warfare, but only when they fought other humans. Zekthara continued. When they fought alien species, those rules no longer applied. We were not fellow humans deserving of mercy. We were threats to be eliminated. The crystal being's voice grew stronger, but filled with despair. He told me that every human soldier, every human commander, every human civilian understood this instinctively. They did not need orders to fight brutally. They did not need permission to use psychological warfare. It was simply how they responded to threats. She moved back to the microphone, her scarred surface reflecting the lights like broken mirrors. But the most terrifying thing Captain Morrison told me was about human unity. He said that when humans fought among themselves, they were divided by nations, religions, ideologies. But when they fought alien species, all humans became one people. Zekthara, 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of helplessness. He said that every human, regardless of their background or beliefs, would support the war effort against alien invaders. Children would work in factories. Scientists would develop new weapons. Artists would create propaganda. Everyone would contribute to the fight. The alien's voice dropped to a whisper again. He told me that the Vorthan Empire had not just attacked human colonies. We had united the entire human species against us. Every human in the galaxy now saw us as enemies, to be destroyed. She looked around the room at the assembled representatives, her crystal eyes reflecting their terrified faces. Captain Morrison said that humans had learned something from their thousands of years of warfare. They had learned that the only way to ensure peace was to make war so terrible that no one would ever want to fight them again. The alien survivor turned to face Captain Morrison one final time. He told me that the brutality we had witnessed was not the result of human anger or hatred. It was the result of human calculation. They had chosen to fight like demons because they wanted to terrify every other species in the galaxy. Zekthara. Form seemed to dim even further. He said that when word of human tactics spread throughout the galaxy, other species would think twice before attacking human worlds. They would remember what happened to the Vorthan Empire and choose to negotiate instead of fighting. The crystal being's voice became barely audible. Captain Morrison called it peace through superior firepower. He said that humans had learned to make war so horrible that it would prevent future wars. She stepped back from the microphone, her entire body trembling. And then he told me the most frightening thing of all. He said that everything we had experienced, all the brutality and psychological warfare, was just the beginning. He said that humans had weapons and tactics that they had not yet used against us. The alien looked around the room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. He said that if the war continued, if the Vorthan Empire did not surrender completely, he would show us what humans were really capable of when they stopped holding back. Zekthar's voice broke completely now. That was when I realized that the humans had not been fighting us with everything they had. They had been showing restraint. Everything we had witnessed, all the horrors we had endured, was them being merciful. She turned to face the judges one final time, and that was when I knew that the war was already over. We had just not realized it yet. Zekthara stood at the microphone for the final time, her crystal form now so dim that she looked like a ghost in the bright lights of the tribunal hall. The scars across her surface had deepened during her testimony, and her forearms trembled. As she prepared to deliver her final words to the assembled representatives of the galaxy. The war ended exactly 3 days after my conversation with Captain Morrison. She began, her musical voice now hollow and broken. The Vorthan High Command surrendered unconditionally, not because our military forces had been defeated, but because our leaders had finally understood what we were truly fighting against. Captain Morrison remained motionless in his chair, his weathered face showing no sign of triumph or satisfaction. Lisa Harper had closed her tablet and was listening intently to every word. I was released as part of the surrender agreement, Zekthara continued. Captain Morrison personally escorted me to the transport ship. As we walked through the corridors of the U.E.'s Retribution, he spoke to me one final time. He said that the war had been necessary, but not enjoyable. He said that humans took no pleasure in what they had done to us. She paused, her crystal eyes reflecting the lights like broken glass. But then he said something that has haunted me every day since. He said that if any other species ever attacked human worlds, the response would be even more severe. He said that humans learned from every conflict, and they would be better prepared next time. The alien survivor moved closer to the judge's table, her scarred surface catching the light. When I returned to Vorthan space, I found an empire that had been fundamentally changed. Our military leaders were in shock. Our politicians were terrified. Our civilians were demanding answers about how such a young species had defeated us so completely. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more frightening. But the changes went deeper than fear. The humans had not just defeated us militarily. They had changed how we thought about warfare itself. Every military academy in the Empire began studying human tactics. Every strategic planning session included discussions about how to avoid human-style conflicts. The crystal being's form seemed to crack even further as she continued. I traveled to other worlds after the war, trying to understand how the galaxy had changed. What I found was even more disturbing than the war itself. The humans had not just defeated the Vorthan Empire. They had terrified every other species in known space. She turned to face the tribunal directly. On the Krex homeworld, I met with military commanders who had never fought humans. They were redesigning their entire defense strategy based on reports of human tactics. They were building new weapons, training new soldiers, creating new protocols, all to defend against an enemy they had never encountered. The assembled representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many of them belonged to species that had done exactly what Zekthara was describing. The Stellar Coalition had begun, developing psychological warfare departments, she continued, not to use against humans, but to defend against human psychological attacks. They were studying Vorthan prisoners of war, trying to understand how human mental tactics worked. The alien's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The free traders. Alliance had stopped all commercial contact with human space. Not because of trade disputes or political differences, but because they were afraid. They were afraid that any contact with humans might lead to conflict, and they had seen what happened to species that fought humans. She paused, looking around. The room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. Even species that had never heard of humans before the war began changing their military doctrines. Word of human tactics spread through the galaxy like a plague. Every species began preparing for the possibility that they might someday face human forces. The crystal being's voice grew stronger, but filled with despair. I realized that the humans had achieved something that no other species in galactic history had ever accomplished. They had changed the nature of warfare itself, not just for themselves, but for everyone. She moved back to the microphone, her scarred surface reflecting the lights like broken mirrors. The galaxy had operated on certain principles for thousands of years. Wars were fought with rules and limitations. Civilians were protected. Prisoners were treated with dignity. Surrender was accepted with honor. Zekthara's 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of helplessness. The humans had shattered all of those principles. They had shown that warfare could be total, unlimited, and completely without mercy. They had demonstrated that rules only mattered if both sides agreed to follow them. The alien's voice dropped to a whisper again. But the most frightening thing was not what they had done to us. It was what they had done to the galaxy. Every species now knew that such brutality was possible. Every military leader now understood that wars could be fought without limits. She looked around the room at the assembled representatives, her crystal eyes reflecting their terrified faces. The humans had not just won a war. They had changed the definition of what war could be. They had shown the galaxy a new level of horror, and that knowledge could never be forgotten. The alien survivor turned to face Captain Morrison one final time. I have spent the last 2 years visiting worlds across the galaxy, speaking to military leaders, politicians, and civilians. Everywhere I go, I hear the same thing. They are all afraid of humans. Not because of human military power, but because of human psychology. Zekthara's form seemed to dim even further. They have seen what humans are capable of when they choose to fight without limits. They have witnessed the cold calculation, the systematic cruelty, the complete willingness to sacrifice anything for victory. And they know that this is not the worst that humans can do. The crystal being's voice became barely audible. Captain Morrison told me that humans had been holding back during our war, that they had weapons and tactics that they had not yet used, that they had shown us mercy, not brutality. She stepped back from the microphone, her entire body trembling. Every species in the galaxy now lives with the knowledge that somewhere in space there is a race of beings who have perfected the art of total warfare. Beings who can fight without mercy, without limits, and without fear. The alien looked around. The room at the horrified faces of the assembled representatives. The humans have not conquered the galaxy through military force. They have conquered it through fear. Every species now knows that the price of fighting humans is complete destruction. Zekthara's voice broke completely now. And the most terrifying thing of all is that the humans know this. They understand that their reputation for brutality is their greatest weapon. They cultivate it, maintain it, and use it to prevent wars. Before they begin, she turned to face the judges one final time. That is why I am here today. Not to seek justice for what was done to my people, but to warn you about what the humans have become. They are not just another species in the galaxy. They are something new, something that changes everything. The crystal being's form was now so dim that she looked like a shadow. The age of civilized warfare is over. The humans have shown us what total war looks like, and that knowledge will spread. Other species will learn human tactics. They will develop human weapons. They will adopt human psychology. She stepped away from the microphone for the final time. The humans have not just won a war. They have changed the galaxy forever. And we are all living in the world they have created. The silence in the great hall was complete as Zikthara returned to her seat. Captain Morrison sat perfectly still, his face showing no emotion. But as he looked around the room at the terrified faces of the assembled representatives, a small, cold smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The tribunal had heard her testimony. Now they would have to decide what to do with the knowledge. That humanity had become the galaxy's greatest predator, and that they were all living in a universe where humans set the rules of war.